Okay, welcome everyone. This is the Plastics, Pipelines, Fracking, and Our Planet webinar. We're going to hear from a really great panel of speakers about how the plastics industry and the fossil fuel industries are connected and how we need to act now to stop the planned expansion of these industries for the sake of our health, our climate, and our planet. So I'm Emily Worth. I'm with Food and Water Watch and Food and Water Action, and I'm really pleased with the fantastic lineup of speakers that we have tonight, who I'll introduce to all of you in just a few minutes. So I want to first start by thanking all of you for joining us tonight, as well as our allies and partners who have shared this webinar with their networks and their activists. I'd specifically like to thank the Progressive Democrats of America, People Demanding Action, the Euclid Safety Coalition, Tejas, and the Break Free from Plastics Network. I also, of course, want to thank our speakers for participating in this important and timely webinar. So before we get started with the program, I just want to give you a quick orientation if you're joining us on Zoom. And this would be a good time to mention that if you're not already joining the screen share, that we highly recommend doing that by clicking the link in your email. We're here on video, and at some points there might be some slides that are shared in the webinar. We'll be keeping everyone who joins as an attendee on mute, and this just cuts down on all the background noise and makes it so that everyone can hear the speakers. But we will be taking questions throughout the webinar. So if you have a question at any point in the presentation, you can click the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen. And we'll get through as many questions as we can throughout the webinar. And then at the end, we'll have some time set aside for questions and answers. I also just want to take note that if you see a raise hand function, we're not going to be using that. We're just using the Q&A. If you have any questions, click on the Q&A. And then lastly, if you have any technical issues at all, or if you're joining us over the phone and you want to ask a question, you can email this email address. It's help@f as in food, w as in water, action.org. So help@fwaction.org. You can email that address if you have any issues, or if, like I said, if you want to ask a question, but you're joining us over the phone. So with that, I think we should start our program. I just want to start by saying I'm personally very excited about this webinar, as I think it's so important that we all understand the interconnectedness of the fracking and the plastics industries. And you're going to hear a lot more about this from our speakers. But these industries are operating on a global scale to drive the expansion of both fossil fuel extraction, the build out of the infrastructure associated with that, and also the productions of plastics. And these industries are having impacts on our air, our water, our health, and they're contributing to climate change. That doesn't even mention all of the pollution problems that the plastics industry is causing in our oceans and rivers. And these are affecting marine life, but also fish that we eat. So all of these issues are interconnected, and we must understand how these problems relate so that we can work strategically to stop these industries and protect our water, air, health, oceans, and climate for future generations. So now I'm going to go through and introduce the full panelists, and then the full panel of speakers, and then we'll hear from the speakers. So I'll start with Sandra Steingraber. Sandra is a biologist, author, and cancer survivor who writes about climate change, ecology, and the links between human health and the environment. And her highly acclaimed book, Living Downstream, an ecologist's personal investigation of cancer and the environment, was the first to bring together data on toxic releases with data from the US cancer registries, and was adapted for a documentary in 2010. She's a contributing essayist and editor for Orion Magazine, and is currently the Distinguished Scholar in Residence at Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York. Next, we'll hear from Juan Parras. Juan has been organizing community voices for years, beginning as a social worker with the Harris County Welfare Office, and later with the City of Houston's Section 8 Housing Department, where he organized workers. Juan eventually was elevated to be an international union representative for AFSCME until 1993, where his efforts reestablished MLK Day and impeached Governor Meacham of Arizona. In 1995, he began the longstanding battle which started against the construction of Cesar Chavez High School and formed Unidos contra Environmental Racism, which was later renamed the Texas Environmental Justice Advocacy Services, or TEJAS. Juan was the original member of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council and has served on many other boards. And he's currently an environmental justice ambassador for the Gulf of Mexico Alliance. Our third speaker tonight will be Rebecca Britton. Rebecca Britton is the founder of the Euclid Safety Coalition and a school board member in the Downingtown Area School District in Chester County, Pennsylvania. Rebecca and her family live approximately 450 feet from the Mariner East 2 pipeline, and her children will spend 24 hours a day, kindergarten through 12th grade, living in the blast zone of this dangerous energy transfer partners project. The Euclid Safety Coalition is a grassroots bipartisan assembly of safety-conscious citizens that's dedicated to educating and engaging the community about the fracking to plastic to waste journey of a hydrocarbon. And they are putting their community in vulnerable populations at risk for the overseas export and plastic production. And lastly, we'll hear from Allison Grass, who's the Deputy Research Director at Food and Water Watch. She's an experienced watchdog and public interest researcher and an advocate on energy, climate, and water issues. Her research includes energy issues such as hydraulic fracturing in pipelines and other energy projects, and she's been doing extensive research on campaign finance and money in politics as well. Allison has a master's from Alabama A&M University in urban planning with a specialty in environmental planning and a bachelor's of arts in mass communications from the University of Alabama in Birmingham. So I know that was a lot, but that's only just a small summary of the incredible work that our speakers have done. And so at that, I'd like to hand it over to our first speaker, Sandra Steingraber.
Hi, everyone. How's the technology working out, Emily?
Your volume's a little low. If there's any way you could turn it up just a bit, Sandra.
Okay.
That's better, thank you.
Is that better? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, hi, everyone. It's the last day of spring, and tomorrow is the year's longest day, which means we'll have maximum hours for photosynthesis here in the northern equator. Photosynthesis, of course, scoops up carbon dioxide from our atmosphere and provides us oxygen. So it brings happiness to all biologists across the northern hemisphere. I'm actually speaking to you from the Finger Lakes of New York, which is my home. And we are also a frontline community. Products of fracking are targeted to be stored in the salt caverns underneath Seneca Lake. And as you may know, there's been longstanding spill resistance to that.
Sandra, we're still having a little.
I see our conversation tonight as the kind of confluence of two mighty rivers. And these are both rivers of activism. On the one hand, we have a global campaign on what's being called the plastic predicament. This non-biodegradable waste that refuses to disappear is filling up our oceans, which of course slide downhill from everything else on our planet, killing marine life, and there are health impacts all along the way, from the manufacture of plastic through its use and disposal. And just to give one example, and we'll talk about others, incineration of one kind of plastic, PVC, is the leading cause of dioxin, one of the most powerful human carcinogen we know about going into our cooking. And of course, the plastics crisis is now in the headlines every day. Just today, we heard that the breeding population of seabirds in Scotland.
Sandra, it's a little hard to hear you.
All the breeding population of seabirds in the entire of Europe. They've experienced a big drop in population. Climate change is part of the story, but plastic is another big part. Long-term monitoring of dead seabirds that have washed up shows that they're all just absolutely chock full of plastic. And so that's one, dealing with that crisis is one of these rivers. And the other is the global campaign to stop fracking. In the specific sense, and in the larger sense, the campaign to keep fossil fuels in the ground altogether. Fracking is a kind of newish technology that uses water, chemicals, and sand as a club to smash apart shale bedrock in order to extract oil and gas that would otherwise be unable to flow to the surface on its own. And really, it's fracking that's keeping the fossil fuel party going long after it should be curfewed. And I've sailed both of these rivers of crisis. I'm currently serving as the science advisor to Americans Against Fracking, and I am the co-author of this report, which is a compendium of findings on the risks and harms of fracking. And I guess I'm just going to say, I'm not using fancy slides tonight. Both of my parents are public school teachers, so I'm going to do really nerdy things and hold up my audiovisual aids. So
Sandra.
this is a compendium of all of the data showing public health harms and environmental harms, including climate harms from fracking, and it's available as a free download at our website. It's Concerned Health Professionals of New York. If you just Google our name, you'll find it, and it's available to you to use. Before I did all this work on the health impacts of fracking, I looked at chemical reform issues, specifically the health risks around PVC plastic. And that a lot of that work was done in a white paper I helped to create for Healthy Building Network, looking at PVC as a building material. And then it was really brought home to me when my own hometown in Illinois, nearby there is a PVC plant that actually exploded to smithereens in 2003, closed all the interstate highways, killed workers, contaminated a whole large area with dioxin. And so I went back to my hometown and researched that terrible industrial accident. So for me, looking at both of these rivers of crisis, I would say that the contrast is that plastic creates waste that we desperately want to go away, right? But it never entirely disappears because there are no enzymes that can break plastic apart. And so it just piles up in our various ecosystems, especially in our ocean. And because it's not benign biologically, it's still biologically active, it causes harms all along the way for the 1,000 years that it persists in the environment. By contrast, fracking is energy, provides us energy that we need energy, but it's always going away. It's non-renewable. So fracking provides us something that the more we frack, the more it disappears. Plastic provides us something that we want to disappear, but it refuses to leave, right? And yet what they have in common is that they both create a public health crisis, and they're both responsible for a global environmental crisis. Plastic is killing our oceans. Fracking is killing our climate and destroying fresh water and creating health risks all along. And they're actually causally linked, right? Because fracking that brings oil and gas up to the sunlit surface of the earth and deep below the bedrock is what provides us the raw materials for which plastics are made. And so that's the connection that we're exploring tonight. Plastics are petrochemicals, oil, and increasingly gas is their starting point. And because of the fracking boom, we now have the plastics boom. And so, so I just want to say, I guess, that I'm really thrilled that on the call tonight, we have people who are working on the plastics issue, and we have people working on the fracking issue, because we really occupy kind of two different activist and scientific communities. And I am not in any way a political strategist, so I don't know if out of this beginning conversation, we end up forming a mighty coalition, or if we kind of continue to engage in parallel play as we do our good work going forward. But it's good for us to hear what the other half is doing, because there are many choke points along this kind of terrible causal chain here, that if we can stop fracking, we can deal with the plastics problem. If we can decrease the demand for plastics, we decrease the demand for blasting oil and gas out of the ground. So all along, upstream and downstream, we can all be working in concert, kind of holding up our own little part of the universe here. Out of the ground comes gas and oil, and it can either find a burner tip. It can either become the whoosh of our furnace kicking on, the blue flame of our stove. It can go to a power plant to make electricity, or we can use those bubbles of oil and gas that are fracked out of the ground to make stuff. And I tried very hard in my research for this talk to figure out what % of oil and gas is actually used to make plastic. And I finally realized that was an unanswerable question when I read this in a document from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, which is kind of the final word on these things. It said the U.S. EIA is unable to determine the specific amount or origin of the feedstocks that are actually used to manufacture plastics in the United States. So even the Energy Information Administration doesn't actually know. What we can say is about 2% of all the methane that comes out of the ground, which is natural gas, is used to make anhydrous ammonia, which is a fertilizer. So that's one product, one thing that we make instead of burning natural gas. But increasingly, plastics are made from gas rather than oil. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit of a chemistry story. naphtha is the starting point for plastic if you use oil as the starting point. If you use natural gas as a starting point to make plastics, then something called ethane is your starting point. And I'm going to back up and explain that a little bit, but I want to tell the story sort of existentially first before I throw myself into the chemistry. So 400 million years ago, all these shale bedrocks that lie across the United States represented the floors of ancient oceans. And when the sea creatures who lived in these oceans fell to the floor, it was a time in our Earth's history when there wasn't as much oxygen in the atmosphere as there is now, because there weren't so many land plants yet. And so these creatures, which are mainly sea lilies and squid, and diatoms and plankton, like fish hadn't even evolved yet, right? When they died and fell to the floor of this ocean, it was so oxygen poor that their bodies couldn't decompose the way they would now. And so they turned into these bubbles of hydrocarbons, which 400 million years later, we are now blasting out of the shale, which is the kind of fossilized ocean floor. And those bubbles are the products of fracking. And then they are brought to a petrochemical plant, turned into plastics, which then fill up our oceans, which then get inside the bodies of currently living marine animals and turn them into corpses. So we're, in other words, blowing apart ancient Devonian cemeteries to exhume the vaporized corpses of animals and plants that lived 400 million years ago, turning them into stuff that then kills currently living marine organisms. That's my existential connection between fracking and plastics. Now I want to do a little bit of chemistry with you. All right, so here's me being a biology teacher again. This is what methane looks like. It's got 1 carbon and 4 hydrogens. This is what we send down pipelines to your furnace or to a natural gas power plant. That's methane. That's mostly what natural gas is made out of. That's a vaporized corpse of some ancient animal, right, that didn't decompose all the way. Now, all these ancient animals didn't just become methane. So down there trapped in the shale are all kinds of other lightweight hydrocarbons. Here's another one. This one is called propane. And it's got, you can see it's got 3 carbons with a bunch of hydrogens around it. It's also a good fuel, as is butane, which is cigarette lighter fluid. Now you have 4 carbons. This burns actually a little hotter than propane, but we don't put butane, you don't have butane tanks in our backyards in the rural areas. You have propane tanks, because butane actually freezes at a higher point than propane. So propane works best in cold areas, but butane is really great for cigarette lighter fluid and also in your camp stove because it burns pretty hot. And then this is what ethane is. So you can see that ethane has actually got 2 carbons rather than methane's 1. So all these things are trapped in the shale. They come up with fracking. Methane is put in a pipeline and called natural gas. And then these other things, the so-called natural gas liquid, butane and propane, are taken to other places. Propane and butane are really useful as fuels. Ethane isn't, but it's a great building block to make plastic. And the first step in making it is to crack this molecule apart and turn it into ethylene. And this is what's known as the workhorse for petrochemicals. So with this as a building block, which I want to say is also very explosive and flammable, all kinds of different plastics can get made. All right, that's the end of my chemistry lecture. And so ethane, this double molecule, this double carbon molecule, is taken into what's called an ethylene cracker. So to turn ethane into ethylene, it requires really high temperatures, and then eventually you get ethylene, and then you can kind of chunk them all together and get what's called polyethylene. So in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, Shell has proposed one of these big cracker plants to turn all the ethane that comes out of the ground with the methane into ethylene. And overnight, it will make Western Pennsylvania, that facility, if they build it, that cracker plant will become the largest source of volatile organic compounds. These are VOCs, very potent air pollutants. Of course, Pennsylvania already has the world's the U.S. third worst air quality, and it will definitely be made worse. At the same time, Formosa Plastics in Texas is planning a $2 billion expansion, again, to turn ethylene into plastic. Of course, once you have the ethylene molecule, you can go a lot of different ways with it. Polyethylene is, of course, familiar to us. It's packaging material. It's also milk and water bottles. You can have high density and low density polyethylene, or like things like dry cleaner bags. And that's the number 1 and number 2 that you see in the recycling symbols. You can make PVC, polyvinyl chloride, by attaching chlorine atoms. And from there, you can make shrink wrap, siding, gutters, building materials. You can make polycarbonate. You can make polyurethane. Number 5 is polypropylene, which are takeout containers, microwave containers, yogurt containers. Number 6 is polystyrene, which are packing peanuts and those clamshell takeout. Overall, the amount of plastic in the world has gone up by 20-fold since the 1960s, and production is predicted to double again in the next 20 years. And again, that's because of the fracking boom. That's what enables it and makes it possible. The U.S. Actually leads the world in the amount of plastic per person. It's 68 kilograms per capita per year we consume plastic, and 13 trillion tons goes straight into the ocean. We're on track now to put more plastic by weight in the ocean than the weight of all the fish of the ocean by the year 2050. And most single-use plastic is not, in fact, reused or recycled. It's just dumped. This is getting worse now that China is no longer accepting low-grade plastic waste for recycling. The number 1 use of plastic is packaging. And this problem of this constant buildup of plastic all around the world, especially in oceans, is receiving a lot of attention. 200 countries did sign a UN resolution pledging to eliminate plastic from oceans. The EU is kind of leading the charge here. The question has been asked by Morgan Stanley recently, are we at peak plastic yet? And they had to conclude no, we're not. They looked at all the actions to reduce and solve the plastic problem, and what they realized is that production is still going to increase for the following reasons. The short-term reason is that the major petrochemical companies are benefiting from the decision by China not to continue plastic recycling, so that increases demand for virgin plastic, plus low oil and gas prices made possible by fracking, and lack of incentives and targets in consumer companies. Of course, plastic packaging being the number 1. Use of plastic, that's not so much purchased by us, but by companies who are using it. So you're going to be hearing more later tonight about INEOS, this multinational chemical company owned by a guy who is the richest man, Jim Ratcliffe, richest man in the United Kingdom. In November 2014, INEOS announced a plan to invest in shale gas in the UK. It's a petrochemical giant that makes lots of plastic. It's also deeply tied to fracking in Pennsylvania. It has begged U.S. regulators in Pennsylvania in the form of the Public Utility Commission to reopen a pipeline after it was twice closed on the grounds that it was a clear and present danger. And you're going to be hearing more about this tonight too. This is the so-called Mariner East pipeline, which carries natural gas liquid, namely ethane, from fracking fields in western Pennsylvania out to the Atlantic, so it can be carried over to Europe to be turned into plastic. And of course, it's INEOS that's challenging Scotland's own fracking ban, taking it to court. Happily, it lost. And so Scotland's fracking ban is holding strong as of this fall. It is INEOS's bidding to frack in England, so we'd love to get a supply of ethane closer to home, but in the meantime, it's deeply reliant on the ethane that co-occurs with the methane in the shale of western Pennsylvania. So the people of western Pennsylvania are paying a high price for living there. So to close then, all along this chain of crisis, there are health risks. If we start at the point that the drill goes into the ground, we can see that the people who live near the well pad where fracking happens suffer disproportionately from certain kinds of health impacts. They have increased air pollution. They have risks for water contamination. We see health impacts in pregnant women who live close to these facilities. They have higher risk for certain kinds of birth defects. In some places, in other places, they have higher risk for preterm birth, and we see that in several different states across the United States where fracking is practiced. Once the gas is put in the pipelines, whether it's methane, propane, butane, ethane, or propane and butane often travel by truck, there are health risks to all the communities through which these pipelines pass, not the least reason of which is because they have to be pressurized with compressor stations, which are a leading source of air pollution. Of course, there are risks of explosions. People are living in blast zones, and you have risk of water contamination, air contamination, and health risks all along the pipeline route. Then, when you have the petrochemical crackers that turn ethane into ethylene, you have risks to workers. Brain cancer rates in the workers who work in these cracker plants are elevated, and we're beginning to see risks, higher cancer risks, higher respiratory risk to people who live around these facilities. This is one of the most polluting kinds of industry. And then downstream, we have all kinds of risks for using the plastic. Plastics are splattered with plasticizers. Some of them interfere with our hormones, and so they raise risks for reproductive and neurodevelopmental impacts in children. In their disposal, they can create dioxin and so on. And so we need clean energy. We need different materials to substitute for plastic. So green engineering, green chemistry, green energy are three legs of a stool that will help us break the fracking pipeline plastics connection. And that's it from me. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Sandra. I wanted to give everyone a reminder that we'll be emailing out the recording of the webinar and any other additional resources that come up during the course of the webinar. So I know we've gotten a lot of questions about that. And again, if you have questions, you can type them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Great, so now I will hear from Juan Parras of Tejas.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I was trying to get unmuted and I got some help.
Good.
Anyway, good evening, Juan Parras, as you mentioned. And the comments that were previously made were excellent, so I don't think I have to go through a lot of repeating, what you said. But I do want to say that, first of all, I just want to correct, and this is an error that was made a long time ago. I did not serve on the first NEJAC board, but I served on the second NEJAC board. And I think that's important because I don't want to be thought as, one of the original members of the board, but I have served on the NEJAC board, so have other, excellent people, community organizers. But anyway, the issue regarding these chemical plants that are trying to make plastic in our nation, if you also look at the National Geographic last month, they had an excellent article on plastics and the devastation that is causing, worldwide, not just locally in our states and our cities, but there's national implications that are taking place because of the plastic production and plastic use throughout the world. So having said that, what I would like to tell you is that like I said, they've already explained all the, toxicity of it, the issues that it causes, the harm that it causes to the air and the ground and the soils. So what I like to focus on is that we have a tremendous challenge ahead of us, and it takes a lot of local organizing to fight these chemical plants from coming into our areas and our communities. And that's something that we need more than just educating folks on the toxicity of these chemical plants. It takes a community to really fight back, to organize, and it takes professional people as yourselves and others that are fighting the industry to go into communities and say, look, this is the harm that it's going to cause. It's going to cause cancer. It's going to cause, endometriosis. It's going to cause a lot of health issues connected to this industry. And that's the issue that the industry doesn't admit to. Because what they're telling communities, and a lot of our communities this is what they're being told. They're being told that we're creating jobs, and of course people like jobs and they like good paying jobs, so they tend to support the industry because of that, until they start realizing the impacts that it has on their lives and their children and the community. But then by that time it's too late. So my point here is that we need to fight and resist the construction phase of it and just run them out of town and get them to either relocate or go to an area that nobody's going to be, impacted by it immediately because they're not on the fence line. As was stated earlier, the intention of the plastic refining business is huge, and they plan to expand. In the Gulf states, there's already, let me tell you what they're going to do. There's already a $6 billion project in Freeport, Texas. And then Occidental Petroleum just opened a $1.5 billion ethylene cracker in Ingleside, Texas. And Chevron Phillips has almost completed a $6 billion expansion in Cedar Bayou in Texas. And then, of course, ExxonMobil announced that it's building a 1.5 million per ton per year ethylene cracker in Baytown, Texas. And then we have another facility that is being built again in Ingleside that we're trying to fight. It's going to be the largest ethylene producer in the country, which is, a product that is used to make plastics. So again, our challenges are great. And I hope that, we will learn from the other speakers about the impacts that this chemical, production has in our communities. And that we also not only figure out, explain to people the dangers of living next to these chemical plants, but how we need to resist and fight and make sure that they don't come into our communities and make us, the ones that pay the price for living next to them with no respect, to the communities that are there. Again, if we have to seriously think about how we're going to fight this, we're going to have to be united. All of us have to be united and figure out how we're going to provide resources to where this industry is coming. Because a lot of these communities that they come into are low-income communities, communities of color, what we term as environmental justice communities. And because of their circumstances, it's very hard to fight the industry. But with support from all of the groups and the panelists on this webinar, I think that we can meet the challenge and fight the fight and resist and continue to resist until we win our battles. Now the battles are not hard. I'll just give you an example. A polyvinyl chloride plant was going to be built in Camden, Louisiana a while back. And the community, it was a small community actually, probably less than 4,000 people, Camden, Louisiana, primarily African-American. But they fought like hell to fight the polyvinyl chloride plant, promised them jobs. They said, we'll have a lot of jobs for you. But once we get into the technical and the high-tech equipment and the computer whiz that you need, those jobs will not be available to most of the community. But anyway, the community fought hard against the polyvinyl chloride plant, and they actually forced them to relocate somewhere where their community would not be jeopardized and in harm's way. And that's what we need to do. If we keep running the facilities out of our communities that they tend to come to, then they will have no place to go. And hopefully by that time, we will generate enough, enough interest in making sure that this plastic industry does not function as it functions right now, just inappropriately going into areas and then, destroying those communities. Again, we need to fight back. And if we can be of any help in organizing communities to challenge the industry, we're available and willing to help out any community that needs help. And with that, I'll just pass it on. I think we have other speakers that can address other issues that are important, like anything else, right? So if I'll answer any questions at the end of this program if there's any questions.
Thank you so much, Juan, for those great remarks. So now I'd like to turn it over to Rebecca Britton of the Euclid Safe Fleet Coalition.
Hi, so I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania. We're about 40 miles west of Philadelphia, about 450 feet right beyond the window here is the Mariner East pipelines. It's about 50 feet beyond my property line. So just for a little background information, in 2015, me and my neighbors found out that the Sunoco, a subsidiary of Energy Transfer Partners, reversed the flow of an 87-year-old pipe. They changed the product from home heating oil to a mix of ethane, butane, propane, pentane, and they didn't even bother to tell the residents or first responders. For at least 8 months that went on. ETP is in the process now of adding 2 more lines to the existing easement. They will be Mariner 2 and 2X. These will be high pressure, high capacity lines that have the most unstable gases in the industry flowing through them. All told, there's about 105,000 Pennsylvanians, according to 2010 census data, living within the probable impact radius of these lines, and it does include environmental justice areas of the state. Here in Chester County, it is a high consequence area we are talking about. We have upwards of 30,000 people living in the evacuation zone, and that is only about 20 miles of the 350 miles of pipeline. These gases are colorless, and unlike natural gas, they are heavier than air, which means they hug the land and they tend to pool in low-lying areas. These gases are also odorless. The reason is simple. The pipeline is transmitting fracked materials from Ohio and Western Pennsylvania to a port near Philadelphia called Marcus Hook. Here, the hydrocarbons board large ships called dragons, and they are being transported to Scotland and Norway to be cracked into plastics. And no one wants smelly water bottles or plastic cutlery. ETP is required to have a public awareness program, and yearly homes within 1,000 feet of the line, they get a mailer. And even though the probable impact radius is more than 1,800 feet. These mailers state that should a leak occur, we should run upwind on foot about a half a mile. We're told not to use doorbells, door knockers, cell phones, or cars, because these are all potential ignition sources. Good luck avoiding those in densely populated areas, right? Especially when all those in danger are not properly warned and don't know what behaviors to avoid. So we have no early warning systems here. We cannot use our senses to tell us if we're in danger. There is no odorant again. Our first responders, who at one time thought that if a leak should occur, they will use reverse 911 to inform the public of a leak. Again, that's a bad idea because these are ignition sources. Have never even seen an integrity management plan as required by federal regulations and the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission. They can't develop meaningful emergency response plans because of this. Knowing this, the public has now resorted to collecting our own money for an independent risk assessment so we can develop our own plans and understand the risk as they truly exist. Pennsylvanians and Chester County residents are scared because ETP has the worst safety record in the industry. They've had about 1 leak every 11 days since 2002. Mariner East 1 which is currently in operation after being shut down for a little bit, has leaked 3 times in the past year, and we are really lucky that those gases did not find an ignition source. Also, they have engaged in willful and egregious misconduct in the installation of these pipes. The Delaware River Basin Commission is being asked now to suspend the permits they issued in December 2015. The Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection has halted the project 2 times over the last year, and the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission has halted the project 2 times just this spring for sinkholes and installing these pipelines in troublesome geology because their right-of-way was convenient. It wasn't a planned pipeline in the sense that this was just an easy take location, and they went ahead and Mariners was giving public utility status based on a 1930s easement that once transported petroleum. And what we know is that when that pipeline was built, the populations were sparse and the homes did not exist. So a lot of encroachment has gone on. So public utility status, I'm not sure why they still have it. This is clearly not the case anymore. There is no public benefit to this project. In fact, I only see harm. We are talking about the theft of Pennsylvanians' natural resources for export to create plastics in Europe. So just let that sink in. What I find really troubling is that our PA Constitution states that our natural resources like the Marcellus Shale Formation should be preserved for future generations. I mean, this is personal to me. Not only do my children live in a blast zone, but they will attend every school K through 12 within the probable impact radius of this line. And there's more than 40 schools in the probable impact radius. Our family safety is at risk, our property values bleed, and the economic vitality of the community and region are also at stake here. I certainly wouldn't open a store near a pipeline like this, and we are already seeing impacts to small business. You know, quite frankly, I feel let down by my state government. They are prioritizing industry over people. I feel like our children and our properties have become sacrifices to the oil and gas industry. Euclid Safety Coalition really likes to use this hashtag on social media, defend what you love. This has a lot of deeply personal meaning to all of us. I mean, not only are we fighting for our children's safety and our home values, but I enjoy traveling, snorkeling, swimming in the oceans, and that means not swimming in an ocean filled with plastics. And I am also amongst the 60% of Pennsylvanians that believe climate change is already affecting our state. And we know that cracking these products into plastics leads to climate change. I'm not just opposed to a dangerous pipeline in my backyard. I'm opposed to building a future economy based on oil and gas. As a Pennsylvanian, I recently traveled to Dimock, Pennsylvania, where fracking has made Pennsylvanians have no water for over 8 years. I understand the harmful impacts of fracking in the West, and we can expect to have more and more pipelines snaking past our homes and schools and public places like our libraries and our ball fields and our malls in the East. I want to preserve the pristine beauty of our state and a wholesome environment free of threat and unacceptable risks. I don't live in my backyard. I feel like I live in my community and I live in the world. And I believe we must do better. Mariner East is the frack to plastic to waste journey of a hydrocarbon in the form of a bomb in people's backyards. It's a real and significant safety hazard. It has global impacts to our ecology, marine life, climate, and ultimately, this all impacts our human health. These dynamics are not wrong for our state, our country, and our globe. And, you know, I believe in localism. So I heard what Juan said, and that really resonates with me. I believe that people locally need to get on the ground, start paying attention, and fight for a better life for their families. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for those really moving remarks. Great, I want to turn it over to our final speaker, Allison Grass from Food and Water Watch. And you've got slides, so share your screen.
Hey guys, I'm getting my PowerPoint up here. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay, good. All right. So I am going to talk about the INEOS campaign and the US connection. But first, in understanding this, we need to understand how the fracking, the petrochemical, and the plastics industries are relying on each other. So right now, there is what's called a gas glut, or a surplus of low-priced gas. And because it's low price and because there's a lot of it, it doesn't make economic sense to maintain a fracking frenzy and continue drilling a lot. For this reason, the industry needs ways to heighten demand for sources to sop up all this surplus gas and justify more drilling. And this is primarily occurring in two ways, and we'll touch on both these ways. Firstly, by creating new products, such as plastics, they can increase demand. So this is largely being facilitated by huge expansions of existing petrochemical facilities and plastic plants, as well as the build out of new facilities. This build out is primarily occurring in two areas. One is the Gulf region where WAN is, and that's long been the place where I think roughly a quarter of our petrochemicals are produced. The other place is the tri-state area of Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. And this is where much of the ethane-rich frac gas is. And as the other previous speakers mentioned, ethane is a hydrocarbon present in gas, and it is a primary building block to create ethylene, which is a petrochemical. And then that petrochemical is used to make goods and materials such as plastics. So right now, investors are seemingly trying to turn this tri-state area in the Appalachian Basin into the next Houston, Texas. Sandra mentioned that Shell is building one of the nation's largest ethane crackers in western Pennsylvania. An ethane cracker is a type of petrochemical facility that turns ethane into the petrochemical ethylene. The location was specifically chosen to thrive off of the Marcellus and Utica shale formations where this ethane-rich shale gas is present. It's the first new facility of its type to be built outside of the Gulf Coast in 2 decades. This is really monumental and important to pay attention to. In Ohio, there is what's called the Appalachian Storage Hub that's being proposed and underway. Basically, it's a large underground natural gas liquid, ethane's a type of natural gas liquid, storage facility. There's going to be a labyrinth of pipelines that interconnect with it to connect to regional petrochemical and plastics facilities, like the one being built in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, and like one that's being proposed for Belmont County, Ohio. And I think overall there's currently, including those two facilities, about 5 cracker plants being proposed for this region. The second way that frackers are trying to increase demand are through new markets, and this is where the INEOS campaign comes in. This also means there's an increased emphasis on exporting fracked gas. So INEOS is Britain's largest privately held company. It's also a colossal chemical company. They, a couple years ago, contracted with US-based drillers to have these companies supply it with ethane so they could use it to make plastics. Over the past few years, the company's rolled out a fleet of dragon ships, like you see up on your screen here, to supply plants in Norway and Scotland. And the first shipment of frack gas actually arrived in late 2016. So this visual shows the ethane export route that is connecting United States fracking with European petrochemical manufacturing. The Europe-bound ethane is produced in the Marcellus and Utica shale fields in that tri-state area, and it's carried by Sunoco's Mariner East pipeline to its Marcus Hook export facility near Philadelphia. From there, the dragon ships take it 3,500 miles across the Atlantic to these petrochemical facilities so that they can turn it into things like plastics or other petrochemicals. But of course, this is problematic because the largest sector of plastics industry is packaging, and these are things that are immediately discarded and tossed away. So therefore, an increased investment in petrochemical and plastics infrastructure is going to result in an increased amount of plastics pollution littering our landfills, littering our streams, our oceans. And to drive home this example, I'm going to turn to the bottled water industry, which relies on polyethylene terephthalate, or for easier shorthand, PET plastic, to make their single-serve bottles that contain water. On average, each US citizen is guzzling about 39 gallons of bottled water a year, but this consumption is stacking up in incinerators, landfills, oceans, litter. In 2015, I think it was an estimated 70% of PET bottles were not recycled. Instead, they're being discarded, they're being trashed, they're landfills, they're in the oceans. And in 2016, 4 billion pounds of PET plastic was used for bottled water production. And that's enough to more than fill the Empire State Building. Plastic litter is also harming our ecosystems. In 2010 alone, nearly 200 coastal countries generated over 600 billion pounds of plastic waste. Between 11 and 27 billion pounds of this ended up in our oceans. So this litter is creating and also adding to a colossal amount of litter in our ocean systems. In the Central Pacific Ocean, the perfect example is probably this slow-moving plastic soup that circulates among where 4 different ocean currents meet. It's dubbed the Great Pacific Garbage Patch and is literally the world's largest dump. This plastic contamination, though, is a significant threat to wildlife. It entangles them, it chokes them, it ends up in their bellies. And one perfect example of this is in Scotland, near INEOS's Grangemouth facility, one of the petrochemical complexes receiving US-based ethane. Large nurdles, which are basically large plastic pellets, are being found in about 15% of endangered puffins. So what can we do? How can we break free from plastic? Firstly, we must stop plastics from being produced in the first place. One solution is to rapidly shift to 100% genuine renewable energy by 2035, to stop the drilling and fracking, which will stop petrochemical manufacturing, and then we will stop plastics from being produced in the first place. Promoting ethane infrastructure is only going to encourage more drilling. It's only going to lock in more climate change. It's going to result in billions of dollars being sunk in infrastructure that burns gas and toxic petrochemical processing. It's going to prevent us from moving to a sustainable energy future. But consumers can also play a role in securing a sustainable future by making conscientious shopping decisions. People should limit their purchases of non-biodegradable plastic products, which is an activity that effectively supports and finances the oil and gas industry. And I will get off my screen here so we can get to some questions.
Great, thank you so much, Allison.
Yeah.
Juan, I actually wanted to ask you a question that I think ties these issues together. I know that many of the refineries and other major petrochemical plants are in the Houston area, and I was wondering if you could describe how the increasing hurricanes and storms is harming those facilities and what that experience is like on the ground.
Well, what we compare what happened in our communities is to, it was very visual on TV, the flooding that actually occurred in communities, right? You saw the water just going up to the roof of houses, people trying to evacuate, you know, just to protect themselves and get out of the flooding. What we had in our communities, what we call the second storm, and that was the release of just all kinds of toxic chemicals into the air. Mm-hmm. And because that's invisible to the eye, the current policies in the city are to address flooding issues and come up with a plan to address, you know, the prevention of flooding, but they're not tackling the issue of how to prevent those toxic exposures that came into our communities. You know, we're talking about benzene. If you've seen the video that we have on Google, regarding Manchester, it'll show you that it's literally surrounded by industry. So they had a huge release. The Valero company had a huge release on Valero. And we didn't, well, the residents knew about it, but the public did not know about it until almost a week afterwards. And then even then, the state and the regulators, because they had turned off the air monitors, it was difficult to actually evaluate how much of the benzene leaked into that community, or just went all over the place in that Manchester community. So those are serious issues that we have in what we call the belly of the beast. There's a lot of industry, there's a lot of chemical plants, and we're inundated with air toxins. And we are hoping that after, considering what they're doing for Harvey to address the water quality issues or flooding issues, is that they also will come up with a plan to address the air quality and come up with a regional air toxic plan to deal with the air toxins that we breathe daily. As you know, these toxins, cause a lot of cancer in our communities. There's studies that indicate that we have a high rates of leukemia if you live within a 2-mile radius of the Houston Chip Channel. There's been numerous studies by Union of Concerned Scientists, Environmental Justice Health Alliance, HARC, Houston Area Research Center, Texas A&M. They've all done a lot of studies in our communities that test for cancer-causing chemicals and air pollutants. And they all basically have found that we're exposed to 12 hazardous air pollutants, 7 of which are cancer-causing. And they make recommendations, to the city and to the state and to EPA about what should be done. But to date, I can tell you that very, very little has been done to address the air toxins that are created along the Houston Chip Channel. And so that's a serious concern to us, and I don't think it's gonna diminish anytime soon, because instead of regulating the industry and forcing them to, not release so many air toxins into the air, we're actually a state that is very pro-industry and are given more permits to pollute more, instead of trying to reduce the toxins in the air. So those are issues that we have, and of course I can go on and on talking about just how bad we refer to it as Houston, and they don't like us calling Houston, but we want to send a message out there that that's really the realities in a lot of communities, because Houston, while we claim to be the 4th largest city in the nation and growing, it needs to address the air toxins that we breathe in communities that live along the Houston Ship Channel and just the Gulf states. The Gulf is open to offshore drilling. As you know, under the Trump administration, he's allowing that. We also are concerned because we have a 52-mile stretch of nothing but refineries and chemical plants, like I stated earlier. And so we're very concerned about chemical security policy, or referred to as a risk management plan, that has been delayed by the administration for 20 months and probably will continue extending that delay of implementation of, good policies to regulate the releases of chemicals and make them safer. So again, there's multiple issues that we are facing, and I'm certainly happy to be on this webinar so that more people can realize that we need help in the Houston area, as other communities need assistance in the communities that the challenges that we face are just immense here. And I just want to add another note that basically has a lot to do with the chemical industry. When I started doing environmental justice work, the industry called themselves the Chemical Manufacturer Association, which means that they produce and make chemicals, right? But to appease the protests against the industry, they had numerous meetings that I was invited to attend. And that's where they finally came out and they changed their name to the American Chemistry Council. And they did that, strategically to change the attitude of what we thought about chemicals. It's American Chemistry Council, it's American, right? It's chemistry, it's not chemicals, and council is like we're good neighbors and we're good people, right? So we have to figure out how to challenge the industry when they change their propaganda, to make it seem like, hey, this is nothing but great news for us when they invent new ways to make plastic and then do not deal with the toxicity factors of it. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Just one last question is, aside from the lifestyle choices, what are other solutions to stop this production of plastics and to kind of move the public sentiment on this? And Allison, maybe you want to chime in. Sandra, we had trouble hearing your audio, so if we can hear you, you can chime in too, maybe. But Allison, you take it first, and then yeah.
Sure, thanks. That's a great question. So the way that I would frame it is that the expansion of the petrochemical and plastics industries are essentially propping up a faltering fracking industry. So these petrochemical and plastic manufacturers, they're sopping up this excess gas, which is helping to alleviate the gas glut that I mentioned earlier by creating a demand to continue fracking and drilling so that it can become profitable again. The symbiotic relationship between the fracking and plastics industries creates a mutually profitable and polluting partnership. The fracking industry gets a new buyer and the plastics industry gets new supplies. So while it's a win-win for them, it's a lose-lose for us. But we can make big changes. Already the public sentiment on fracking's changed since it really first came to light. For example, recent polls have found that people are now opposing fracking rather than favoring it. And we can change the public sentiment similarly on the issue of petrochemicals and plastics manufacturing with people like you that joined the call through education campaigns, through grassroots organizing, and through putting pressure on our elected officials to make the necessary policy changes that we need.
Great. Any final thoughts from anyone? Great. Well, I want to just say, you know, there are so many ways we can work in our communities. We can stop fracking. We can stop the pipelines like Rebecca and her community are facing. We need to stop the petrochemical plants affecting Juan and his communities. We can pass local and state bans on the, you know, single-use plastics, plastic bags, straws, cutleries. Those measures are starting to take off, and we've seen them happening in Europe and around the world. And as Allison mentioned, we can push for bills that are going to move us off of fossil fuels onto renewable energy. Those are happening at the state and local level. There are ordinances, there are state bills. There's also the Federal Off Fossil Fuels Act. And if you want to find out more about how to get involved in that, you can go to offossilfuels.org at the website, and there's information about how you can get involved and try to move your member of Congress or your local elected official to support that. That's going to decrease this whole cycle. So just in closing, we will send around a recording of this with information about how you can get more involved and links to the resources that were shared on this. And I'd just like to really thank our amazing speakers, as well as all the partners and allies who shared this with their networks. And I want to thank all of you for spending your free time tonight joining us. We couldn't do any of the work that we're doing without this incredible network of activists and allies. So I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and thank you so much. Bye.